This podcast is brought to you by North Carolina's Electric Cooperatives.
This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome. You've heard and read the spin the media and the politicians have put on the issues of the day. To get the correct spin on what's going on in North Carolina, let's introduce you to our panel of experts. They include former representative from Nash County, Gene Arnold, NC Policy Watch's Chris Fitzsimon, syndicated columnist and author John Hood, and former state senator and cabinet secretary and chair of the State Board of Education, Howard Lee. Well, this week our panel is going to discuss several controversial public school issues. We'll examine Governor Cooper's veto and the legislature's override on the merger between the Ethics Commission and the State Board of Elections. And we'll get the panelists' takes as to whether a $1 billion tax cut might create future budget shortfalls. And of course, as usual, we ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. Let's get started. We want to spend the first part of the program talking about education issues that are creating a stir. The first involves an ongoing argument as to who's in charge of public education. You might remember the legislature passed a bill that stripped the State Board of Education of many of its powers. A 3-judge panel put a stay on that new measure until a full hearing could be held in June. But in a somewhat strange turn, the new superintendent of public instruction, Mark Johnson, filed a document in court saying the current board is severely limiting his authority, either ignoring or denying his request to make staffing changes. Howard Lee, in his complaint, Johnson says the board routinely appoints committees to vet his potential hires instead of voting on his recommendations. Having served as chair of the State Board of Education, what's traditionally been the procedure when the superintendent recommends a person to be hired?
Well, of course, this is kind of watching a rerun of a bad movie because we've gone down this road many times before with tugs and wars between the superintendent and the state board. Traditionally, the state board has always accepted the recommendations of the superintendent. They may have conversation, but also the superintendent has always made sure that the state board chair had conversations with him and they could go to the state board with a unified approach to approving staff, but not questioning the superintendent's right to choose staff that he needs to work with.
So in this particular instance, Johnson may have some legitimate reason to be concerned, John.
Well, he does because he's the elected state superintendent. Now, as Howard says, I mean, for decades, people have been puzzled by the fact that we have a state board of education, we have an elected superintendent. It's odd. It's not like the local area where an elected school board would hire a superintendent. It's not like a cabinet secretary where someone's appointed by the governor and clearly beholden to somebody else who's elected. So it's a complicated scenario, but as long as we're stuck with it, and apparently we are for now, we're going to have to make it work, and the only way to make it work is, as Howard says, to be like before.
Well, Chris, I pulled out my state constitution and started reading the thing, and it says that the board shall supervise and administer public education in North Carolina. Then it goes on to say that the superintendent is the secretary and chief administrative officer of the board. What does that say to you about who does what?
Well, I think that's what we're going to find out in the court, I think, in the lawsuit. But I think most people expect that if this continues to go to a trial, and I thought for a while, I think there was a rumor or reports that they were trying to work this out. Doesn't look like that's happening, that the state board does have the most authority in education that is given to it by the Constitution. But we do have an elected superintendent. A lot of this, I think, could have been avoided if Superintendent Johnson had come into office and started working with the new board, had met early on with Chairman Kobe. And remember, this is not, it's very important, this is not a Democrat-Republican issue.
Exactly.
Bill Kobe was a former state Republican Party chair. I think that Superintendent Johnson waited too long. They need to figure this out. I do think the state board has the authority in this case.
Gene, Chairman Bill Kobe says he was baffled and shocked at Johnson's court filing and indicated that he and the board were willing to try to find some common ground with Johnson. Is it possible the court's going to have to decide this part of it?
Well, I hope so, and it would be nice to find the answer to the first part of your question as to who is really in charge of education in North Carolina, because I've been trying to find that out the past 25 years. I think it's time to seriously look at appointing the superintendent of public instruction and let him report directly to the governor and make the governor responsible for education.
All right, let's move on to another controversy that's going on. State lawmakers passed a bill that would restrict the number of students in grades kindergarten through third grade from 24 to 19 students. School systems have said without the additional funding, they'd be forced to eliminate PE, music, and arts programs or increase class sizes in upper grades, and are asking for more flexibility. Gene, the legislature finally decided to delay for 2 years the imposition of these size restrictions. Was that a good idea, and do you expect the school systems will ultimately prevail in having more flexibility?
Well, I think they should. Whether or not they will can only be seen in the future and what the General Assembly lets them do. An easy answer to all of this would be teacher assistants. Well-trained teacher assistants, and then you don't need buildings or anything else. So we're going back into full circle. One other thing that would help tremendously if you had some way to prevent the General Assembly from making education policy.
Goes back to the governance issues. Howard,
Yes,
we've been
does.
told for years that the sizes of the classes, particularly in the early grades, make a big difference. The smaller the class, the more individual attention the teacher is able to pay to each student. Isn't that essentially what the legislature was trying to accomplish here?
Well, I think so, but this class size question is one that has been debated on infinitum and will continue to be. I'm personally not convinced the class size has a direct impact on quality of instruction. Regardless of the size of the class, you still have people with different levels of students with different levels of performance ability, and it puts a burden on the teacher to try to deal with those students regardless of the size. As Gene said, if we went back to having some support in the classroom like teacher assistants, that person could then take some pressure off the teacher. But I don't think doing a class, moving toward class size in and of itself is going to change the outcome of
Chris,
instruction.
one of the parts of all of this discussion that I found interesting is that there seems to be some very legitimate concern among some of our legislators saying that the public school systems have enough money to employ art and PE and music teachers and so forth like that. They're just not spending it right.
Well,
in fact, they're asking for audits.
Well, what they did was ask for each district to figure out, to send a survey in how they're spending the money. That information is actually available on DPI's website, and the General Assembly did not give schools enough in the last 3 or 4 years to reduce the class size down to where the legislature wants to do it. The other thing nobody's talking about enough is the capital needs. Imagine if you had a class of 24 kids and all of a sudden you can only have 21. Well, you have to have a lot more classrooms in 1 year, which is almost virtually impossible. The Wake County Superintendent was talking a lot about that. This was not very well. I actually applaud the idea. I think you have to go lower than 21 to have a dramatic impact. I think they're going in the right direction. So if the intentions are good, then why not give them the support they need to do it?
All right, so John, they put a hold on this essentially for 2 years.
Well, a year later than originally planned.
Right from this fall.
So what's going to end up happening here?
Well, I would hope that cooler heads would prevail. I think this is basically a detour from school reform to talk about class size as if these kinds of changes matter significantly. They do not. By the way, gentlemen, I would respectfully submit teacher assistants don't have an effect on the outcome either. The actual evidence is clear that we should be focused on the quality of the teacher. If you have a great teacher, you don't want to expose a smaller number of students to that teacher. You want to expose a reasonable number of students. We should be focusing every dollar on recruiting and retaining better teachers. Class size is fine if you've got plenty, if you've got every other priority held, but it should not have been our priority. Our priority should have been to continue the process of improving
You get
teaching.
to close this, Howard.
Well, I certainly think John makes an excellent point, but it doesn't make any difference about how good the teacher is if we have students there that need a lot more attention than the students who don't need attention. But that teacher needs some help in that classroom in order to be able to carry out an instructional process that has a positive outcome.
Have you signed up to receive our free weekly email newsletter Spin Cycle? It's easy. Just go to our website, ncspin.com, and sign up. And while you're there, you can view the latest NC Spin show, get video footage and perspective pieces not seen anywhere else, and read my weekly column. Get more balanced debate for the Old North State at ncspin.com, NC Spin on Facebook, or on YouTube, or on Twitter at NC Spin Tweets. After these messages, we're going to talk about school districts and lawsuits.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
I hear it all the time. Rising health care costs are squeezing North Carolina families. Deductibles continue to climb, prescription drug prices are skyrocketing, medical bills are unknown until they arrive in the mail, and premiums are increasing by double digits. This is decimating family budgets. We should be focused on education and jobs, not EpiPen cost and medical bill errors. We need quality, affordable, and transparent health care for our families.
Many of the 300,000 uninsured in our state are volunteer firefighters, farmers, fishermen, and small business owners. Let's create a North Carolina solution for covering the uninsured. To learn more, visit careforcarolina.com.
We now return to NC Spin.
Back in the 1960s, North Carolina had almost 170 school districts, but under pressure from the legislature, that number's been consolidated to 115 now. Some lawmakers feel districts have become too large and want to institute procedures for breaking up into smaller districts so as to be more responsive to their respective communities. John, we've always been told there was some economy of scale in consolidating school districts so as to avoid duplicate staff and so forth. Is there a legitimate argument to be made for allowing districts, especially in larger counties like Mecklenburg and Wake, to break apart?
This is what a statistician would call a non-linear phenomenon. There is definitely an economy of scale when you have a couple of really small districts and you combine them, because you have some fixed costs and you're spreading it over a larger number of students. But when you get up into the tens of thousands of students, if you keep merging districts, you have a diseconomy of scale. It costs more money per student to have these massive 120, 130, 150,000 student districts. They ought to be broken up. Now, in North Carolina, we hear this story about school merger, and we immediately flash back to the 60s and, urban systems and county systems, white and black and all that. A lot of the people who are driving this debate, that's not what they're talking. They're from New Jersey. They're from Massachusetts. They're from fairly high-performing states that have hundreds of school districts, and they come to North Carolina and they're puzzled that there's only one in their county. And that's a lot of what's driving this debate.
Howard, you frequently have said that schools are too large. Are you talking about the districts, or are you talking about the individual buildings themselves, or both?
Yeah, I'm talking about the individual buildings. I happen to be a part of the process that reduced those districts from 170 to 115. No, it's the schools that I'm most concerned about. The district itself, I think is right to be the size it is, and it's going to continue to grow. But a good superintendent can lead that district. It's kind of like you and I talked one time about having a good principal in a school. A good principal in a school can make all the difference, and a good superintendent in a district can still carry that district to a successful level.
Gene, you were president of the Public School Forum in North Carolina. I'm sure this subject came up about the size of school districts. What's y'all's take on that?
Well,
or your take?
It is exactly what Howard was saying, where you have a good superintendent like an Ann Denlinger or someone of that character in Johnston County, you can get the job done. So it depends on the quality of the individuals running the schools.
So Chris, where is this movement coming from? Is it legislature? Is it schools?
There are a lot of folks
personnel?
in the legislature. I think it's being sponsored by Chris Malone, who's one of the sponsors, who's a former Wake County school board member, who's now in the General Assembly. But I'm not exactly clear on the point. I mean, one of the things that big systems can do is give students a lot of flexibility and choice within the public school system. Wake County and Charlotte-Mecklenburg County have massive magnet programs. In a lot of ways you can move kids around in the public school system and still keep them in the system. So I hope we don't go down this direction.
And I know we're still in the talking stage here, but I mean, how would who would determine who's going to break this system apart?
You have to draw them very carefully. This is primarily a Wake and Mecklenburg driven issue. It's not really that big an issue, even in Guilford and Forsyth that I'm aware of. It's really Wake and Mecklenburg. And I think in the long run, if you think that Matthews and Mid-Hill are not going to get their own school districts, or that Cary's not getting his own school district, I think you're betting wrong. That's what's going to happen eventually.
All right, I want to change topics here because there's another issue that's been front and center this past week. The tune is familiar, even though the lyrics may be slightly different. The legislature is intent on merging the Ethics Commission with the State Board of Elections. Blocked by a 3-judge panel, lawmakers went back to the drawing board and changed the legislation, giving the governor the power to appoint board members, but stipulating the nominations have to contain an equal number of Republicans and Democrats. Cooper vetoed the legislation, and lawmakers have once again overridden it. I want to ask each of you. The question is whether the legislature changed enough about the previous bill so as to pass the courts. What say you, Howard Lee?
I don't think so. I think what the legislature did was to put a little lipstick on what I would call a pig, and it's still a pig. I think the bill is still a problem.
And you still can't teach a pig to sing.
And you still can't teach a pig to sing. But I don't think they did enough to make it happen. And wish that they would get really serious about trying to get back to where we were, because I thought that was the best outcome.
John?
I disagree. If the court was serious as an initial objections, the legislature has responded. Because the initial objections were not whether this was a good idea or not. I'm not sure it's a good idea myself. Their specific objection is that a separation of powers problem because the governor did not get to appoint the members. In this scenario, the governor appoints all the members. There are plenty of scenarios in other boards, other scenarios where the governor is given a list. There's a variety of things like that. The governor is still making a choice, still choosing the members, and you no longer have a supermajority requirement. I don't know if it'll stand for other grounds, but this bill appears to respond to the original legal objection.
Chris, what do you think?
Well, I think I agree with John that we don't know if it's a good idea or not, because the General Assembly still hasn't had a thorough public hearing and invited anybody to testify about it, which is the biggest problem about this thing. But I think from a policy and process perspective, I'm not sure the court's going to go along with it or not either. I mean, you could see where giving Governor Cooper a list of 2 or 3 people saying you have to appoint one of these people may meet the spirit of the decision. I mean, the letter of the decision, but does it meet the spirit of the decision? And would it be the same thing to say, we're going to give you one name and you have to appoint him or her? I mean, I think the court's going to have to decide whether or not having a narrow list that he chooses from infringes on executive powers.
Did they do enough, G?
I think they did, and I like it. If they would simply add a judge to settle all disputes or the tiebreaker, then I think you've got a better situation.
Ah, interesting. Well, so far as it goes, Cooper says that he vetoed it principally because, as has previously been the case in lawsuits, this is an executive branch agency. And he's concerned that with 4-4 membership, there's going to be an awful lot of tie votes and there's going to be an awful lot of being tied up.
Well, and I think that's the crux of the issue. What makes it an executive branch agency or a legislative branch agency? Is it just the appointments? Is it something else? And by the way, it's worth remembering, not only will there be a tie vote, they staggered who's going to chair the commission. The Democrats chair the commission in the odd-numbered years, the Republicans in the even-numbered years, which, of course, that's when all the elections are. So this is clearly a partisan grab. This could have been done a lot better, a lot more thoughtful. We may need changes. This is not the way to do it.
So what's going to happen until... Interestingly enough, the legislature themselves went back to the court asking for a decision on this.
They're trying to expedite. They want to see whether these changes comport with the original ruling of the court. Again, the court is not being asked, is this a good idea? Would you rather have a different policy? That's not their role.
Is it
their
constitutional?
role is simply to determine if it's constitutional under a traditional understanding of separation of powers.
So what happens between now and then? We still have a separate state board of elections and a separate ethics commission and so
well,
forth.
I hope there aren't any major disputes in the near term.
Yeah. The Ethics Commission has no business being included in all of that. The Ethics Commission was really, in the very beginning, designed to keep anyone from investigating legislators.
Exactly. And they've done a darn good job.
That was a separation of powers problem.
After this break, we're going to talk about whether tax cuts could lead to a budget deficit. Stay with us.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
I am Kathy Merritt, and I have worked at Cherry Hospital, a state-run psychiatric facility, for 27 years. Like 1 in 3 state employees, I still earn less than $31,000 a year because we haven't had a decent pay raise in years. When I started at 20 years old, that was a wonderful thing to have a state job. That's not the case anymore. And I love the job that I do. I just can't make it on what I do. It's not right. I work very hard. I love what I do, but it's difficult when you're not getting paid for what you do. You can't raise 2 kids on the salary that I had and not work another job and not apply for food stamps and not apply for medical benefits for your children. Tell your legislators to support a pay increase for state employees. Learn more at scenic.org.
The healthcare landscape is filled with questions and uncertainties of changes that are coming. In these times of change, there's one thing you can trust: You can trust your family physician to work for you, not only in treating sickness and disease, but also your overall health. Regardless of how healthcare might change, the men and women of the North Carolina Academy of Family Physicians pledge to work upholding your trust. Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisors.
You sleep on concrete till your body get immune to concrete.
My mom got my brother and I up and said, come on, we're leaving.
I became homeless in the beginning of this year.
When I was about 4 or 5 years old, our house caught fire.
I used to see my brother. If he see me, he'd turn and go the other direction.
We did the only thing that we could think of, and we went to a Salvation Army shelter.
You know, we don't have this, like, what's your background look like? We just say, what do you need?
I remember the man from the Salvation Army coming down with a box of clothes.
The Salvation Army officer bought my brother and I an ice cream cone.
Last week, my brother walked up to me, and he just started a conversation.
Today I've given my life to the Salvation Army because I remember what somebody did for me, my brother, and my mom over 30 years ago.
The Salvation Army for me means hope.
Compassion.
Family.
Support.
We now return to NC Spin.
As lawmakers are working on a proposed state budget, we've learned the House would recommend a $500 million tax cut, while the Senate wants to cut $1 billion from the current revenues. A report from the Fiscal Research Division of the Legislature predicts that if spending trends continue as they are now, that could lead to a budget shortfall of as much as $600 million over the next few years. Chris, Fiscal Research assumed that between inflation, population growth, and current spending trends, we were going to see increases of 4 and 4.5%. Folks on the right are saying, wait a minute, that's not very accurate because we've been increasing spending about 2.5%, so therefore there's not going to be a deficit. You wrote a long column about this, which I found very interesting. Explain your point.
Well, I mean, I think fiscal research is saying if we fund things that we think that most people think we ought to fund, if we give state employees some kind of reasonable raise, if we keep up with inflation, if we increase teacher salaries, if we do other things, and we cut taxes by $1 billion, we'll have a shortfall. Now, if we cut taxes by $1 billion and we don't raise principal pay from 50th in the country, or don't keep raising teacher pay, or don't fund enrollment increases and do all those things, it doesn't mean we have a shortfall, but it's a bad idea to keep cutting taxes.
John, this week you also wrote a column in which you were urging legislators to be very cautious in making big changes to the state budget. Does that include tax cuts?
It includes tax cuts and spending increases. Just be careful, because I don't think we're going to get, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but looking at the data that we have right now, I don't think we're going to get some massive April surprise. Revenue growth is solid, but I would not describe it as spectacular. And there are some areas of the budget that are growing faster than last year. Others are growing slower. I just would be cautious. Also, we're pretty far along in this recovery. Economic recovery, as modest as it has been, it's been fairly lengthy. So the risk of recession in the next couple of years is not low.
Gene and Howard, I want to ask both of you the same question, because both of you have been involved in putting together state budgets. Given all the uncertainty coming out of Washington, all the talks about shutting down the government, tax cuts, everything that's going on, health care changes and so forth like that, should that be a warning flag to our legislature? Let's don't go making major changes.
I trust the Fiscal Research Division more than I would the Senate budget writers. I think that you generally, in the 90s, we saw an increases of about 3.5%. You don't have to cut $1 billion. You can cut $500 million now, and later you want to cut more when you know what's coming down the pike. You can.
What do you say, Howard? He didn't particularly respond to my Washington analogy, but should that give some?
It absolutely should, and I've always felt that you really do have to trust your staff. The staff keeps a handle on what's going on in Washington, and they can read trends, and they advise the legislators, and we really need to listen to them. I also have a great deal of respect for John's ability to analyze these kinds of things, and but putting
Chris,
those two together.
Let me ask you a closing question here. It's the Senate's year to come up with the budget proposal first. Where are they in that process?
Well, I wish we knew. It's been 2.5 months since I think 2 months since we had a public budget meeting. The budget, I think, will roll out in the next couple of weeks.
All right. Well, we'll certainly be talking about it when it does happen. After these messages, we're going to ask the panel to tell us something we don't know.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
The cost of everything has gone up dramatically over the last 75 years. With one exception, keeping electricity affordable. That's the power of your co-op membership. Learn more at togetherwesave.com.
North Carolina's Touchstone Energy Cooperatives, looking out for you.
12,000 North Carolina veterans are uninsured with no options to buy health insurance. They fought for us. Now let's fight for them. Let's create a North Carolina solution for covering the uninsured.
To learn more, visit careforcarolina.com.
I am Kathy Merritt, and I have worked at Cherry Hospital, a state-run psychiatric facility, for 27 years. Like 1 in 3 state employees, I still earn less than $31,000 a year because we haven't had a decent pay raise in years. When I started at 20 years old, that was a wonderful thing to have a state job. That's not the case anymore. And I love the job that I do. I just can't make it on what I do. It's not right. I work very hard. I love what I do, but it's difficult when you're not getting paid for what you do. You can't raise 2 kids on the salary that I had and not work another job and not apply for food stamps and not apply for medical benefits for your children. Tell your legislators to support a pay increase for state employees. Learn more at scenic.org.
Now it's time to ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. Howard Lee, I'll start with you.
Well, I spent some time in the Department of Natural Environmental Resources with a bunch of students this week, and I'm so impressed with our students that are engaged in trying to find ways to clean the air, including building electric cars. I think we've got some fantastic students in our schools.
Good. John Hood, tell us something we don't know.
Some weeks ago, when the initial attempt in Washington to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act petered out, North Carolinians got a lot of attention. Mark Walker, Mark Meadows. Now that those negotiations have returned, look for Mark Meadows and for Patrick McHenry to be critical parts of the story.
Interesting. Chris, tell us something we don't know.
I'll follow up on that. Senator Richard Burr is finding himself now in the limelight after pledging to have a fair and open investigation of Donald Trump's ties, if there are any, to the Russian hacking. He's now balking at signing requests for evidence. He's going to be under a lot of heat in the next couple of weeks.
Gene Arnold, tell us something we don't know.
Tom, I turned 80 years of age this past year. I am retiring from everything as soon as possible. My wife says I won't be able to tell the difference, but we'll see.
How will we know?
Yeah.
Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, give your feedback, and read my weekly column, be sure to visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. And join us next week when we're going to talk about what bills survived the crossover deadlines and which ones didn't. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
Join us next week and get the spin on issues facing our state.